Hello everyone, and welcome. Today I bring you the love story between Eloise, the fifth sister of the Bridgertons, and Sir Philip Crane. So without going on too long, let's get started. The story between Sir Philip and Eloise does not begin with a love story. On the contrary, it begins with a tragic story of sadness and death, the death of Marina Thompson. Contrary to the previous protagonists, Sir Philip was not a single man in search of a wife, nor in search of love, but on the contrary, he was a married man with 2 children. Philippe had studied botany, graduated at the top of his class, and planned to go into teaching, but the sudden death of his elder brother forced him to change his plans radically. He became the sole heir to his family's lands, and thus to such obligations as taking over the administration of his estate, marrying and begetting heirs. His wife, Marina Thompson, was a rather sad and melancholic person. Philip had never really been able to create a relationship with her, not even a connection, as his depression had not allowed him to do so. In the books, Philip is described as a man in his 30s, dark-haired, dark-eyed, tall, stocky, tanned, and muscular. Eloise is described as a 28-year-old woman with brown hair and gray eyes. The story begins one sunny afternoon in February. Philip was in his greenhouse when he saw Marina walking in the woods. The simple fact that she was out of the house was strange, so he followed her to the lake. There, he saw her submerge of her own free will. He managed to pull her out alive, but a few days later, she died. Philip did not love her. He had never loved her, but she was the mother of his children, and at no time did he wish her deed. Philip didn't exactly consider himself a good father either. He found it hard to communicate with the little ones, a pair of 7-year-old twins. He didn't know how to talk to them or what to say to them. Even telling them about their mother's death wasn't easy. So once Marina died, he decided that he should get them a mother. It didn't matter who she was or if she was pretty, educated, or intelligent. It would be enough if she smiled and was happy, and loved the children, or at least pretended enough for them to believe it. One afternoon, after Marina's death, Philip received a letter from Eloise Bridgerton, Marina's distant cousin, offering her condolences for her loss. Curious about this unexpected manifestation, Philip decided to reply to the message. Eloise used to make a hobby of sending letters to people she had not seen for a long time, either congratulatory or condolence messages. She was thrilled to have communication with other people. Sister Felipe's reply pleasantly surprised her, for his letters denoted the words of someone cultured and educated, and he added a flower that he had cut himself, which touched Eloise's heart. They exchanged letters for about a year until Philip decided to extend an invitation for her to visit him at his house in the country. But not only that, in the same letter, he expressed his intentions to make her his wife. Naturally, this took Eloise by surprise, although she had already suspected that Philip was trying to woo her through letters. At her age, already considered an old maid in society at 28, she had turned down 6 marriage proposals, not because she didn't like any of those suitors, but because she was too picky about them and was looking for someone perfect. Besides, she wasn't worried about being single. She was happy with her brothers, sisters-in-law, and nephews, and being a Bridgerton, she was still respected, even if she wasn't married. However, her best friend Penelope, with whom she thought she would share her spinsterhood, had married none other than her brother Colin. Although it was a selfish thought, Eloise would never have thought that Penelope might marry before her, or that she might even marry at all, for the poor thing had never received a single marriage proposal, so Eloise had never considered how she would feel if she were the only single one of the two. Despite this, she loved the fact that her brother had married her best friend. They were perfect for each other, but now, as a single woman in a family full of loving couples, she felt the need to take Sir Philip at his word. So she decided to accept Philip's invitation with the plan to meet him for a few days to find out whether or not they would hit it off and then decide whether or not to marry him. Eloise knew that her brothers would not allow her to go to Philip's house without even meeting the family, so she decided to elope in secret. So during a dance at her sister Daphne's house, Eloise slipped through the crowd and left, without telling anyone, not even Sir Philip. For his part, Philip had taken it for granted that Eloise didn't want to marry him, since the letter of proposal had been sent a month ago and he hadn't heard back from her. Eloise seemed like the perfect solution to his problems, a surrogate mother for his children who couldn't even stand nannies. Phillip was surprised to see her on his doorstep unannounced. She seemed immediately beautiful, with huge gray eyes he could drown in, he thought. Despite this, Phillip was a little rough around the edges, so their first meeting was not as romantic as Eloise had imagined it would be. But what shocked her most was the fact that Phillip had children, since he had never mentioned it to her in the letters. He denied not telling her, though he had clearly left it out on purpose. That he had children was not a problem for Eloise, as she loved children, but she clearly didn't know what was coming. Phillip, for his part, was annoyed that she was arriving unannounced, since she hadn't given him a chance to prepare to greet her, write her a poem, or prepare some flowers. Moreover, Eloise's appearance surprised him, as he had expected a woman less pretty and therefore more desperate to marry, and not a young, beautiful, and self-confident girl. He was sure she would never want to marry him, take care of their 2 children who drove away all the nannies and live in the countryside, far from London society and all those social events. Eloise, for her part, had found him to be a rather ill-mannered man and was beginning to think him a bad father, as he did not know how to deal with his 2 children. However, her plan to stay in that house for a fortnight to find out how compatible they were still stood. Oliver and Amanda, Phillip's 2 children, were extremely mischievous and resourceful, and would not accept a new woman coming into their lives so easily, so on the second day they decided to pay her a visit and warn her that they did not want her in their home. Eloise, who was the 5th of 8 siblings and the aunt of 9 nieces and nephews, found the perfect words to make them understand that she would not leave and that she was not afraid of them, although that was not entirely true. After that unexpected meeting, Phillip and Eloise met and had breakfast together. Phillip had planned to have a pleasant breakfast as an apology for his behavior the day before. But when he found Eloise already eating, he had no choice but to join her. Over breakfast, she told him of her encounter with the children, and he confessed to her frankly that she was not what he had imagined, that in fact, he thought she was beautiful, and that he didn't understand why he hadn't married her yet. And though it wasn't the first time Eloise had heard flattery, it made her blush. Phillip was not like other men. He was coarser, less refined, not like the common men of London. He was more defiant. Eloise could not see how a man like him could have any trouble getting a wife. Phillip asked the question, how it was that now, suddenly, and after turning down several proposals, he had decided to marry. She replied that she had simply discovered that she did want to get a husband after all. She then returned the question. Phillip replied that no woman who knew his children was willing to set foot in his house, and that was why he had invited her to come, because the children needed a mother. Eloise then asked him which role he wanted her to assume, that of mother or that of wife. Both, he replied, as if it were obvious, and she asked again, which of the 2 is more important to you? To which he replied that he didn't know how to separate the 2. Eloise's beauty was unsettling Phillip, but in a good way. It had been a long time since he had been intimated with a woman, for after Marina had her children, they had only shared a bed on one occasion when she didn't participate, didn't even move, just lay there with her eyes fixed on nothing. Phillip had felt dirty and guilty, so since that encounter he had never again crawled into Marina's bed. Eloise's presence, beautiful and slender, was stirring his desire again. Intrigued by their last conversation, he invited her to the dining room for dinner that evening, but when he was at the door of her room, he found that Oliver and Amanda had played a joke on him by filling her with flour. Eloise, of course, wasn't going to let them get away with it, so she decided to prank them back by putting a fish in Amanda's bed. During dinner, she asked Phillip if the children were aware of his marriage proposal, to which he replied no, something she seemed to disagree with but chose not to say, but by her gestures, he could tell. So he asked her to please keep her opinion on raising her children to herself until she decided whether or not she would marry him. Eloise replied that they needed more attention and love, which they did not receive from him, even though they explicitly asked for it. This annoyed Phillip, who replied that she didn't know him, Eloise was annoyed by this comment, but decided to let it go. Phillip, for his part, was increasingly realizing that Eloise was the opposite of Marina and just what he needed: intelligent, self-confident, bossy, and he was hoping with all his might that she would agree to marry him and take charge of the house and their children. She, for her part, was discovering more and more how attractive she found Phillip. After dinner, Phillip took Eloise to see the family portraits, where she had the opportunity to see the faces of her grandfather, her father, and George, her late brother, who had died at the Battle of Waterloo. Phillip explained that he was only 21 at the time and that Marina was actually George's fiancée, not his, but he didn't want to talk about his father and was tense when Eloise asked him about it. She also saw a picture of Marina. Eloise remembered her childhood, when they were both little girls. Marina had dark hair and blue eyes, and since they were the same age, at family gatherings they were always put together, even though they were very different. While Eloise enjoyed playing and running after her older siblings, Marina preferred to stay reading the same page of a book over and over again. Seeing Marina's portrait made Phillip very uncomfortable, which made Eloise wonder if he had loved her, if he had been in love with her when she was still his brother's fiancée, if he missed her. Eloise decided to tell him that she had lost her father when she was still a child, how difficult it was for her siblings, and especially for her mother Violet, who was still pregnant with Hyacinth. After this, they went to the greenhouse where Phillip showed her his plants and some of the experiments he was working on, and for the first time, he found that someone other than himself was sincerely interested in what he was doing. That night, in the shadows and surrounded by plants and flowers, Phillip couldn't help himself and kissed her, and she kissed him back. The next morning, the twins continued their revenge. They put a rope in the middle of the path, causing Eloise to trip and hit herself hard. This prank infuriated Phillip and made her notice that something wasn't right, as he seemed to be holding back a lot in the situation. The misstep caused Eloise to bruise her eye, and she was forced to rest for the rest of the day. This led to an argument with Sir Phillip, who left her alone with the excuse that it was not convenient for him to be with her because of his anger. By now, Phillip was convinced that he wanted to ask Eloise for her hand, would kneel before her and beg her to marry him and be the mother of his children. He was aware that he was doing everything wrong and didn't deserve Eloise's acceptance. But, in all honesty, he had never wanted that life for himself. It had always belonged to his older brother George. He was the charming one, the favorite son. He always knew what to say and what to do in every situation. Everyone loved and admired him. Phillip, on the other hand, was quieter and more reflective. He had always had the idea that he would be the gruff, eccentric uncle who lived in Cambridge in a greenhouse, doing experiments that no one would ever be interested in. But George's death had changed everything, and he had been forced to take on the duties that had never been his. The only thing that saved him from that situation was the fact that he had his children, whom he loved unconditionally, but even so, he couldn't help feeling like a failure. He didn't regret being a father, but he thought he wasn't born for it. He was disappointing them, he didn't know how to deal with them, and that's why, in many cases, he preferred to run away. But the night before, after the attack on Eloise, he surprised himself by handling the situation very well in front of his children. So now he felt that she was somehow bringing peace into his life, and this was what finally convinced him that he needed Eloise to marry him. She, for her part, was beginning to feel very attracted to him, despite his oddly distant demeanor from time to time. His smile and his casual manner attracted her to him, and she couldn't help it, and it had stopped her from returning to London just yet. The next morning, Eloise decided that she would share time with Oliver and Amanda, so she took them swimming in the lake, but the walk was interrupted by Phillip, who angrily pulled the children out of the water, claiming that he had forbidden them to come. Eloise argued that there was no reason not to let them come if the children could swim. This, coupled with the memory of Marina's death from that incident in the lake, plunged Phillip into a flood of memories that touched Eloise, who, confused, caressed his face. Phillip put his hand on top of hers and brought it to his mouth and kissed it. then put it on his chest, wrapped it around her waist, and pulled her to him and kissed her. Desire ruled them, but Eloise decided they couldn't take the next step yet. Not like this. That same night they had dinner together, and Phillip shared with Eloise his concern that he felt he didn't know his children well enough, to which she replied that there was still time, but just when it seemed like everything was going great, something happened. Anthony, Benedict, Colin, and Gregory, all just turned 23, burst into the house, all cursing at each other, and within seconds, Phillip was pinned up against the wall with Anthony's hands around his neck and Benedict's hands gripping his arms. He wondered at the time why Eloise had overlooked the not-so-insignificant detail that he had 4 brothers, but he couldn't blame her as he remembered that she had actually mentioned it in her letters. Naturally, Eloise had to intervene in the situation to get him released, pulling Benedict's hair and threatening Anthony. Although with the black eye and the imagination of the 4 of them, it was not easy. After this, Eloise had a conversation with the elder Bridgerton, who informed her that the only solution to the whole situation was for her to marry Sir Phillip, for to be alone with him for so long and without a chaperone would be dishonorable. Eloise wanted to marry, but at the same time, she thought it was too soon for that. They had only known each other in person for 2 days. She needed more time to fall in love. Anthony told her that the only way he would not force her to marry Phillip was if he was an abusive man who would make her suffer. Eloise denied this immediately, and without much else to do, she accepted her brother's conditions. She would marry Sir Phillip. She also confessed to her brother that what had motivated her to come and meet Sir Phillip was the fact that Penelope and Colin had married. She had been happy about the news and loved the idea of Penelope as her new sister, but she could not help feeling that she would now be the only spinster. This softened Anthony, who decided that he would give her a week to get to know Sir Phillip as well and decide whether he was a good man for her or not. That same evening, Eloise moved her bags to Benedict and Sophie's house, which was close to Philip's. Phillip went to visit her the next day, where they chatted about the fact that they would now have to get married. The latter came to visit her the next day, where they chatted about the fact that they would now have to get married. Phillip talked about it as if it were business, which annoyed Eloise, who was no doubt expecting a slightly less dry mariage proposal, although Phillip was clearly not known for being the most expressive and romantic of men. After this, her older siblings appeared and Eloise announced that Phillip had asked her to marry him, at which point he understood that this was what she wanted. He took her by the hand, and with Anthony's permission and the excuse of speaking in private, led her to Sophie's office, where he told her that he would clear up her doubts and show her that once they were married, she would adapt very well. And then he kissed her. He confessed that he thought she was beautiful, and that the first thing he had thought when he saw her was that he could drown in her blue eyes and all of her. He caressed and touched her until he made her moan with pleasure. The next day, it was the Bridgertons who visited Phillip at Ronmy Hall, where they met Oliver and Amanda. At that dinner, Eloise asked Phillip if he had ever been in love with Marina, and if he had ever felt passion for her, to which he replied that he had not. He then asked her why she had decided to run away from London, and she told him her reasons, insecurities, and fears. 4 days later, they were married. It was a private ceremony at Crome Hall, next to Philip's greenhouse. Her family welcomed Amanda and Oliver as 2 members of the family, and Violet had even insisted that they call her grandmother. That day, they had their first night together, and Phillip opened up about his childhood and the abuse he received from his father, who punished him with beatings and whippings, leaving scars on his back. Married life didn't start off in the best way. Phillip hadn't been with a woman for 8 years, so once Eloise adopted his surname, he just had her in his bed every night and disappeared into his conservatory every day, leaving her in charge of the house and the children. Clearly, a marriage wasn't all about sex, but Phillip didn't seem to understand that, and when Eloise, after discovering that the nanny wrapped the children's knuckles, tried to explain it to him, they ended up in a disagreement. The two separated for the remainder of the day. While his discomfort wore off, Phillip decided to check on his children and, thanks to that, discovered the nanny hitting them on the back with a book. He threw her out of the house immediately and went in search of Eloise to tell her she was right, only to find her gone. Eloise had decided she wanted to talk to another woman, one with experience in marriage. And since Daphne and Francesca were far away, she decided to go see Sophie. But when she arrived at her brother's house, she was met with an unpleasant surprise. Benedict and Sophie's little son Charles was seriously ill with a fever that would not go away. His condition was so critical that the doctors could find no solution other than prayers. Philip, who had thought that Eloise had run away again, arrived at his brother-in-law's house to discover the situation, and since there were no other alternatives, he proposed to Benedict to give him a willow bark tea to reduce the little boy's fever, something he had learned in his years of study. The next day, the boy miraculously woke up better, and Philip and Eloise returned home. On the way, Philip confessed to Eloise that he thought he had abandoned them, to which she replied that she would never abandon Oliver and Amanda. That lit a faint flame of jealousy in Philip, not because he didn't want Eloise to love his children, but because he wanted to know that she would come back for him too, that she loved him, because he had just discovered that he loved her too, beyond sex and passion, beyond what a wonderful mother she was to her children and how good she was at running her house. He loved her as a woman, and he hardly understood it. Philip disappeared for the next day, and when Eloise finally found him, he was sitting in front of Marina's portrait, staring at her. At that moment, he told her everything he had experienced with Marina during their marriage, how lonely he had felt, how she had decided to take her own life on the one sunny day that winter, and how guilty he felt that he had not done enough to make her happy, and that he did not want to repeat the same mistake with her. But all his fears were silenced when Eloise assured him that she was more than happy with him. Days later, they shared an outing together, accompanied by Oliver and Amanda. At the end of the day, the children told Philip that it had been the best day of their lives, which no doubt made him thankful that he had brought Eloise into their lives. So he set up a letter search that led her to his room filled with flowers and a petal-armed sign with the word, "I love you," on it. Only then did she tell him what the children had told her, but she also insisted that with her, he could not choose a single day, because each and every one of them was perfect if they were together. Eloise and Philip had 3 more children, Penelope, who was born a year after the marriage, Georgina, who was born the year after Penelope, and Frederick, who was born 3 years later. But the story of Philip and Eloise does not end here, or, well, yes, because, as in all the stories of the Bridgerton brothers, there is a second epilogue, which appears in the 9th book, Bridgerton, Happily Ever After. The epilogue of To Sir Philip with Love is not starred neither by Philip nor by Eloise, but by one of their daughters, Amanda. In it, we are told in the first person how the eldest Crane marries a young man 3 years her senior, with whom she falls in love at first sight, although she says she does not, as she does not consider herself a romantic. But we also get a brief glimpse of Eloise and Philip's relationship, who seem to be as much in love as the last chapter of her book, of how the relationship between Philip and his children improved, of how little Marina meant to them as a mother because of her absence while she was still alive, and of how Eloise saved them all, literally,